we have, now we can maybe circulate the speaker series flyer there. We're going to be inviting a number of speakers hereafter as a part of this class. This is Asian American Studies course, topics course, focusing thoroughly on Japanese American incarceration experience, the wartime Japanese American incarceration experience, and its aftermath. We decided to do this class because the 75th anniversary of the Executive Order 9066 is coming up in February 19, 2017. And to that end, we really wanted to work closely with the local chapter of Japanese American Citizens and incubate, brainstorm ideas and strategies to come up with commemorative activities. JACL, the local chapter, has already started that planning, the commemoration planning. But we as a class also wanted to take part in the process. So we decided to offer this class to incubate ideas, critical perspectives. But along the way, the local chapter members said that they wanted to also participate and be in the class at the same time. So a number of them are here actually auditing the class and participating in every aspect of learning, except of course weekly assignments. They're relieved from that responsibility because they're just auditing. And so our first speaker is Sally. You have no picture. Okay, so I'm going to fix this up. So Sally Sudo was born in Seattle, and again, as I said, as a child, she was in prison for 3.5 years. Starting with, I want to know how to pronounce this, but first her family was taken to Washington, the site of Western Washington State Fairgrounds, and thereafter she was incarcerated at Minidoka in Idaho from 1st through 3rd grades. She was incarcerated along with her family members. Thereafter, her whole family relocated to Minnesota in 1945, August. Received her BS here at the University of Minnesota, and she worked as a public school teacher in the Minneapolis district, retired. And now she's been very active in the local chapter of Japanese American Citizens League, and really raising our awareness and consciousness about this wartime experience, which is quite distinct in our history. So we're very happy to have her. So please help me welcome Sally.
So thank you very much. I do chair the Speakers Bureau for the Twin Cities chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. So if you know of any classroom or organization that would like to have a talk on this topic, you can find me at tcjacl.org under Education tab, and you'll find information on how to get a hold of me. But I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you about my experience and the experience of my family during this time in history. Now I'm going to concentrate really just mainly on the time that we were spent in these camps, because those of you who've been taking this class know all the things that have led up to our being incarcerated. So I don't want to dwell on that. Okay, now how am I going to forward this thing on your computer? Yeah, but it doesn't move. So I have to click on it with that? Okay. Okay, is that what I'm going to have to do?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I just want to give you a little bit of background on my family. We are a very large family of 10 children, and I am next to the youngest of these 10. Now my parents, my father, immigrated to America in 1899 when he was 18 years old, the only one from his family to do so. He came from a little town town called Yawatahama on the island of Shikoku, which is one of the 4 main islands, but one of the smaller ones in the southern part of Japan. And his family had mikan groves. Mikans are mandarin oranges. And they were finding it hard to pay their property taxes. Because if you know a little bit about Japanese history, you know how they were in isolation for over 250 years. And finally, when Commodore Perry sailed in with his black ships and opened up the country to the west, at that time it was the Emperor Meiji, and he was astonished to see how advanced the rest of the world seemed to be. And so in order to quickly modernize his country, he put a heavy burden on those who owned land and property. And so my family, having 3 mikan orchards, were paying a heavy tax burden and having trouble paying their property taxes. So my father, hearing that there was work in America, his family sent him here, which is kind of unusual because he was the oldest son in a family of 6. And usually the oldest son is the one that's going to inherit the land and all. So usually it's, like the second or third son who doesn't have much to inherit that does these things. But for some reason, I'm not sure why, I never bothered to ask him why it was my father that was chosen to do that. So he came in 1899, and then he waited until he was 34 years old before he went back to Japan and married my mother. And this happened in 1915. So she wasn't the typical picture bride that you hear about. He actually went back to his country, and it was through friends and family that they arranged this marriage. And so there's a 14-year difference between my mom and dad. My mom at that time was 20 years old, and my dad by then was 34. And this large family then starts growing up in Seattle. We lived in this area of Seattle called Nihon Machi, which means Japantown. So a segregated neighborhood. If any of you have read this book called Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, which was popular 4 or 5 years ago, that takes place in that part of Seattle that I grew up in. We had 4 boys and 6 girls rather in our family. And the ages ranged from, my oldest sister was 21 at the time of the war, and my youngest brother, Henry, was 3 years old, and I was 6. So if you're doing the math in your head, I will admit I'm 80 years old. Okay? And, we were living what we thought was a very typical, American lifestyle. My father spent most of his life in the restaurant industry and working his way up. First, the dishwasher, and then the waiter, and then finally the cook, and so on. And finally, in 1938, he and his cousin had saved up enough so that they were able to have their own little cafe called the Olympia Cafe in Nihon Machi. And, who knew that 3 years later he was going to lose everything. So, at the news of Pearl Harbor, we heard about it after we had come home from church. We used to go to the local Japanese Baptist church in Seattle. That is all of us, except my brother Tom, who at that time was 14 years old. And he was always one of these kids who, tried to see how far he could go, breaking the rules and all. So instead of being in Sunday school like he was supposed to be, he was at the movies. And he was watching the movie called The Maltese Falcon with Humphrey Bogart. And he said all of a sudden this scroll came across the screen saying, "All military personnel, report to your bases immediately." And he said people started looking around, wondering what's going on. And then when the movie was over, the manager came up and he said, "We've learned that Pearl Harbor has been bombed, so go to your homes quietly." And he said as soon as he got out into the lobby, everybody started pointing at him. "Oh, there's a Jap, let's get him." And he said he just raced out of there with people chasing after him. And fortunately, he got home, but he thought for sure he was going to get beat up, because that was kind of the attitude and the atmosphere of the times. It wasn't long before the FBI came to all of our houses, and they took away what they considered contraband. Now, to them, contraband was your shortwave radio, if you had any binoculars, your cameras, and of course any kind of firearms or Japanese swords, things like that. And my parents, having heard that my father's cousin, who was a strawberry farmer, had been taken away by the FBI, were very concerned that maybe they would be found with something incriminating in our house. And so they were busy burning anything in the Japanese language, like the letters from the relatives in Japan, books, magazines, things like that, even phonograph records with Japanese music on it. They just didn't want to be caught with anything that the FBI might find incriminating. And so you could actually look out all over our neighborhood in Seattle and see all these bonfires going on, because everybody was doing kind of the same thing, getting rid of things that showed that connection that they had to Japan. Now, one of my mother's prized possessions was her hina ningyo. Hina ningyo are girls' days dolls that depict the imperial family and the court. And this is the kind of thing that a mother passes down to her daughter, and then it keeps passing down through the generations. So it's a family heirloom. And my mother just didn't have the heart to destroy this, so she donated it to the principal of the elementary school where my siblings went to school, Bailey Gatzert School. And that school is also featured in the book Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. The first place then we were sent was the fairgrounds at Puyallup, Washington. After President Roosevelt signed that executive order and all these signs started going up in our neighborhood, we knew that it was just going to be a matter of time before we were going to be moved out. And they put up these temporary buildings in the parking lot areas of the fairgrounds, and also in the oval center in front of the grandstand. And they had each of these different areas fenced off with barbed wire fencing, and they called them areas A, B, C, and D, and you were not allowed to go from one area to the other. That brother Tom of mine, who was at the movies, he was so excited when he heard that we were going to go to the fairgrounds, because we had never ever gone to the state fair. And yet when we get there, of course, we're restricted to this area, and you could see the Ferris wheel and those rides, just out your window, but very tempting, but of course you couldn't go there. We were fortunate enough, when I say fortunate, that we got one of the buildings in the parking lots, because there were families that were housed in the livestock buildings. And our building had 6 units in it, and I think at that time we were only given one room, which was like about a 20 by 20 size room. Very bare, very minimal, and we were in this kind of holding pattern all summer long. What they did was they didn't send everybody from Seattle all at once to the fairgrounds. They took us in groups, and they would say on the notices that were posted, okay, those who live between this avenue and this avenue and between these streets, be ready to meet at such and such a place at such and such a time. And maybe about 400 or 500 people at a time then were moved out. Probably in Seattle at that time, there were close to about 8,000 people of Japanese ancestry. So Puyallup is where we were housed over that whole summer, and kind of waiting to see what was going to happen next. Of course, these buildings had no running water, no bathrooms, anything like that. All of that we had to go to public buildings for. And one thing I remember was, because you know, the rain in Seattle and everything, and these buildings were made with raw lumber, it wasn't long before the boards would shrink, and especially, they're pretty much built right on the ground. And so then, as the boards opened up, there would be all this mud, you know, seeping into your room. And one of the men in camp at Puyallup made geta. Geta are these wooden clogs, you know, that have very high heels on them, and he gave them away free. And that was the best thing to have in this situation because of all the mud that you had to be walking around in all the time. I think in one of the readings we had to do for class this week, it talked about people who made these wooden saddles in the camps with spare lumber. So while we were in these camps, they called them assembly centers. But then of course they were building the 10 permanent camps, which ended up being, you know, in these locations. They had 2 in California, Tule Lake and Manzanar. And then eventually I get sent to this one in Idaho, Minidoka, Topaz in Utah. In Arizona, there's Poston and Gila River. And then Hart Mountain in Wyoming. And here it says Grenada. We call this camp Amachi in Colorado. And then the 2 over here in Arkansas, Roar and Jerome. So all of these out in the western part of the United States were in very dry, desert-like areas. They had to be built on public land, federally owned land, and they had to be away from populated areas. They had to be accessible by some kind of public transportation. And so it ended up that most of them were very close to Indian reservations, except for the 2 that were in Arizona, which were in the Mississippi Delta on reclaimed land. So this is a map that shows you the exact location of our camp in Idaho. You can see it's in the southern part of the state, right sort of in the center part, very close to the Utah border. And the closest town of any size was this town called Twin Falls. Here it is right there. And by the time the camp was completed, we were the 8th largest town in the state of Idaho. And it ended up housing close to 10,000 of us. So this map shows you the layout of the camp. It happened that there was a natural canal on the southern border, and then it was composed of 44 blocks, but only about 35 or 36 of them were residential blocks. And then in addition to that, there were 2 elementary schools, one on the, I'll call this the west side, and then one on the east side. And then towards the center part of the camp was where the junior high school and high school were put. Now, but these schools were not really school buildings. I'll get to that a little bit later, but we really just made do with what we could while we were in these camps. The lower right-hand corner shows you the layout of the camp, and as Carolyn pointed out earlier, every one of these 10 camps were built exactly the same way. In the center were what we called the common buildings. This would be the mess hall, and then this letter H building would be what they called the sanitation building. So one side for the men and the other side for the women, and then along either side, usually 6 barracks on a side, so 12 barracks in a block, and each block then housed close to 250 to 300 people. So this is a picture of the people that lived in our block. This was taken in 1944. So by then, quite a few of them have already left. But this is me over here. Let's see if I can get the pen light on it. No, it doesn't show very far. But anyway, I was circled in the flyer that went around. I'm right over there next to my dad. I can see some of my other brothers and sisters sitting in different parts of the picture here. But what they did in our camp was they built sort of like a school annual, only it was, you know, for the whole camp. And so they photographed all the residents in each of the blocks and some of the other activities that went on in our camp, and each one of us had the opportunity to buy one of these yearbooks. Of course, you know, the camp was surrounded by barbed wire, and there were 8 of these guard towers around the perimeter of the camp. So we very much knew that we were in a prison camp. It took us overnight to get to this camp from Puyallup, where we were in those temporary locations. And all I remember with the train ride was that first they bused us from Puyallup to Union Station in Seattle, and we got aboard these trains. And what they did was they took a lot of old trains out of service for this purpose. And so, you know, anytime that we were on our way to Idaho, if there was another train coming by, we always had to go off on the side tracks and wait for that to pass and so on. So it took us, I think it was 27 hours, they said, for us to go from Seattle to Minidoka. And during that time, we were told to keep our window shades down. And of course, there was armed guards at the front and back of every train car. So they were keeping their eye on us the whole time. When we finally got assigned to our room and barrack and so on, we ended up living in block 14, barrack number 2, I remember. And this time they gave us 2 rooms, rooms C and D. So these were rooms that were towards the center of the building. And the way the barracks were divided up, the smaller rooms were on the ends. And they were meant for maybe a couple with a young child or something. Anyway, space for maybe about 3 people. Yeah. And then as you move towards the center, then the rooms got a little larger. So the rooms that we were in were probably, again, 20 by 22 feet or so. But these 2 rooms were not connecting rooms. You had to go out the front door of one and into the front door of the other to get back and forth. But definitely, the buildings were not finished. I mean, I don't know a lot of construction terms, but they had no drywall. You only had the planks that the building was built from, and then the wallpaper on the outside. There were no ceilings to the rooms, so that you could look, actually, you know, climb on something and look over the wall into the next unit if you wanted to. And the only furniture we had was the bed to sleep on. And then there was only one light bulb that hung down from the rafters in the middle of the room, just a bare light bulb. And then we had a pot-bellied stove for the winter. So really very sparse, bare accommodations. And you can see, you know, there's really nothing there. There's absolutely nothing to put your things away on. Anything that you see in the way of shelves, these were things that the inmates built themselves. They scrounged for scrap lumber, and they would build these shelves to, you know, put things on. Otherwise, you just lived out of your suitcase for the whole time that you were in these camps. And I was asking my siblings, how did our family divide up between all of us? And they reminded me that my parents and the 4 youngest of us were in one room, and then next door were my other 6 older siblings. And then they put sheets up so that the girls could have half of it and the boys could have the other half. Now, this is how this is the Chief Judge, William Denman of the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. This is how he described the camps. The barbed wire surrounding the people there was like that of the prison camps of Germany. The turrets for the soldiers and the machine guns were the same. The buildings were covered with tar paper over green and shrinking shiplack. This for the extreme temperatures. See, it got as hot as 110 in the summer and as cold as 20 below in the winter. No federal penitentiary so treats its adult prisoners. Here there were children and babies as well. To reach the unheated latrines, which were in the center of the blocks, meant leaving the residential shacks and walking through rain and snow with no regard for the sick and the children. So also was the crowding of the people in one-story shacks. In the cells of federal penitentiaries, there is no such crowding. So this gives you kind of a realistic picture of really what these camps were like. The first job we were given when we got to the camp was to make our own mattress. And they gave us these big canvas bags that we had to stuff with straw. And then, of course, all of our meals were eaten in the mess hall 3 times a day. So they usually had 2 settings for the meals. And they would switch, like if this month you got to eat in the first setting, then the second month you would be, go second. They based the meals as far as how much they were going to spend on it at 45 cents a day per person. And that was based on what was actually spent on those who served in the military. So in the beginning, our food was really a lot of canned food. I remember lots of pork and beans and Vienna sausages, things like that. And our food really didn't improve until later on when the people in the camp started producing their own produce. I remember that we would get so hungry for real butter. We were under the same rations as everybody else in the country. And so for breakfast, typically we would get something that looked like oatmeal and then just plain bread and margarine to put on your bread. But of course the margarine wasn't even colored, so it's this ugly, white fat that you're putting on your bread. And in those days, they used to serve you milk in these glass bottles, and the milk wasn't homogenized, so the cream would rise to the top. So I remember once we got an empty jar from the kitchen, and we poured off our cream into this empty jar, and we took it back to our room in the barrack, and we all took turns, shaking that jar, making our butter. And just when it got to the point where the butter was formed, my sister dropped the jar. We never forgave her for that. So I wanted to show you again on this map. We're up in the northeast corner. Do you see all these fields that say zucchini, carrots, onions, so on? So this is all the produce that was being grown. So by the second summer that we were there, the food started to improve. And not only that, but they also raised chickens and pigs over here somewhere. And I think all of the camps had their own farms, so that whatever we produced, if another camp wasn't producing that particular crop, then they did trade back and forth between the camps. And maybe this is where people got the idea, because stories had started to appear in the newspaper that we were being coddled in camp, and that we were being fed better than the citizens on the outside. So here are the people then working the grounds to prepare to grow their plants. And the way they ran the camp was that whatever job you had before you were put in camp, they expected you to carry on with that job in camp. So, if you were a cook like my father, then when you got into camp, you were a cook there, and so on. And if you were a professional, like a doctor or a teacher or so on, you got paid $19 a month. And then those who were skilled labor, like my father, got paid $16 a month. And then those that were unskilled labor got paid $12 a month. So in addition to that, we also were given $3 for each person in their family per month for clothing. And where do we get the clothes? Well, in those days, this Montgomery Ward's and Sears Roebuck had these, big catalogs that used to come into our camp, and that's where we ordered things from that we needed. So rain or shine, you'd stand outside, wait in line. Everything in camp was hurry up and wait. Wait to get your meal. wait to go to the bathroom, you know, wait to get washed up, wait to take your shower. Lines for everything. And of course you went through the cafeteria, you know, mess halls, cafeteria style, and this is when our parents really started to worry that they were losing control of their children, because it wasn't long before you know, people like my brothers and sisters would start eating with their friends instead of with their family. And so I know that the parents felt like they were losing control of their children. So here's a typical mess hall scene. We ate at these tables that were sort of like picnic style tables. The showers and the toilets were the absolute worst. You know, here they didn't have any kind of partitions between the showers. You can see how close together the spigots are just off the wall. And you know, I had sisters who were teenagers or young women, and they were very modest, and it was hard for them to have to shower in public like that. You know, of course the men were separated from the women, but still, I think that definitely it kind of had a psychological effect on some of my sisters that were of that age, where they would be very self-conscious of their body. There were some girls that used to wear their bathing suits to go into the showers. Or they were trying to pick times of the day when they knew there wouldn't be that many people there. You know, really late at night or really early in the morning. And then the toilets. Before they got the sewer system in, because when we first arrived there wasn't even the sewer system ready for us. And that was really crude. All they had were like outhouse buildings with a long wooden plank with cut out holes. And then there was some kind of rigged up system where there was a big drum, sort of like an oil drum that was filled with water. And then when you pulled this chain, the water came out and washed all the waste away. But if you sat in the last hole, it would splash back up at you. So everybody was always warned, you know, don't sit in the last hole, don't, you know, so on. But eventually then the sewage system gets put in, but even then, you know, there's no privacy, there's no partitions for the toilets at all. And then I talked about the fact that we did have 2 elementary schools and a junior high school and a high school, but really they didn't provide a school building for us, and no school furniture, and no school equipment. So the men in the camps got busy building chairs that would be the right size for elementary kids. And what they did was they used the barracks in a certain block for the schools. And so that's what you did. You went into, you had a classroom in one of the barrack buildings. And there again, because there were no ceilings, the noise from one end would carry through to the other end. I remember in the beginning, because I was in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade in these camps, that we just sat on the floor to begin with until we got some furniture. And then our furniture were more just like benches, like those benches they used at picnic tables. And so you can see in some of these pictures how people just made do. You can here you can see very much the homemade chairs and so on. Our teachers, the ones I had, were all Caucasian teachers, and we even had some teachers who came from Minnesota. Some of the teachers in the camps were conscientious objectors, and so instead of going to fight, in the military, they assigned them to go and teach in the camps. But also, teachers would get hardship pay for teaching in our camp. It's sort of like if you're a teacher and you volunteer to go and teach at a military base, in a foreign country, you get more pay than you would if you just stayed at a public school in your own state. So we had very few Nisei teachers, Nisei meaning Japanese American teachers. And I think the reason for that is because they were finding that even if they got a teaching degree from their university, they couldn't get a job. The public schools wouldn't hire them. And so I think a lot of them were discouraged from going into teaching. And therefore they had to depend a lot on Caucasian teachers. And so here again, using the bench for your desk and so on. And then these are high school students going to their classes. And here you see them going to different buildings as they're changing classes. So imagine a school without any maps, without any chalkboards. Often it was only the teacher with the textbook, and I'm talking about in high school. And so then the teacher would read to you, and it was your job as a student just to take notes. But of course, science classes without any kind of labs, typing classes with maybe only 2 typewriters for a class of 40 people. And so what they would do is everybody would have cardboard replicas of the keyboard, and you would, pretend type on the cardboard, and then every 10 minutes the bell would ring, and then 2 new people would get to go and actually work on the real typewriter and so on. So I think most of us felt when we got out of the camp that we were definitely behind in our schooling. I mean, I felt like I was a year behind. It's hard to learn how to read when you don't have any extra books to read from. Now, I did mention about the fact that in the newspapers there were stories about how we were being coddled in camp. And so Eleanor Roosevelt actually came to visit one of the camps. She went to Gila River in Arizona. And she brought with her Clarence Pickett. And he was the executive secretary for the American Friends Service Committee, which is the Quaker organization. And she wanted to see for herself, what the conditions in the camp were like. And she used to write this newspaper column called My Day. And so after visiting the camps, she reported that the stories and rumors were not true, that the conditions were very harsh for these people to live in. And the reason she brought Clarence Pickett along with her is because she was really concerned about the college-age students who were losing out on their college education, because they got pulled out of their colleges and universities if it was in that military zone and put into camps. And so Clarence Pickett then helped form the organization that became the National Student Relocation Committee. And what they did was they wrote to colleges and universities in the Midwest and out east, away from the military zone, to see if there would be colleges that would be willing to offer scholarships to students that were in these camps. And so, as it turns out, in the state of Minnesota, the first college to step up and do so was Macalester College. And for those of you who did the readings this week, there was a little story in there about this woman who made these little moccasins so that she could save up enough money for her college-age student to come and visit her. Well, that actually happens to be the sister of my very good friend Lucy Kirihara. Her sister Esther was the one they're talking about. And her mother made these little moccasins, and Lucy still had them. These little moccasins out of Indian beads, and she got 5 cents for every moccasin that she made. And so then she would put her money in this glass jar and until she could save up enough to send for her daughter to come and visit. And she says that the thing of it was that when Esther then finally was able, after a year, to come and visit her family in the camp, and she stayed for 7 days, the camp actually charged the family for the meals that Esther ate while she was there. So talk about insult upon injury, I tell you. Anyway. One of my more vivid memories is of the terrible dust storms that we would have. We never knew when a dust storm was going to hit us. We always walked around with a scarf on us in our pocket or something, because when these dust storms hit, it's worse than a snowstorm, because when it comes at you, it's really like little pebbles hitting you, and it hurts, But we used to cover our mouths and noses especially so that the dust wouldn't get in them. And when you are out walking around, because every single block looked the same, it was very easy to get lost, you know, in a dust storm. But you get back to your room in your barrack and everything is covered with this fine powdery dust. I'm talking about your beds, your sheets, you know, of course the floors, everything. And it's just miserable. I remember when I was watching during the first Gulf War, when they had embedded journalists with the military, and you'd see them riding around in their Jeeps, and then they would be in a blinding dust storm. And as soon as I saw those pictures, I thought, oh my gosh, that's just like camp. You know, it reminded me of what we went through in those camps. The other thing I remember about camp was the snakes. Every morning you'd get up and there would be these snakes underneath your building. The barracks were kind of set off the ground with these cinder blocks, but I suppose that was the only kind of shade that the snakes could find. So they would, you know, they would always be under your building. And usually they were harmless, you know, non-poisonous snakes, but I don't have a lot of rattlesnakes, so we did have rattlesnakes as well. And then it was kind of fun to watch some of the older boys trying to kill the rattlesnakes. And what they used to do is they used to make belts out of the skin. You know, that was kind of their code of honor, I suppose, that they killed a rattlesnake and made it into a belt. As far as, you know, being a child in the camp, really, when school wasn't in session, there was really very little to do. Because we were only allowed to bring what we could carry, and that meant usually just 2 suitcases apiece, and you didn't know how long you're going to be away. You know, you packed your suitcases with your clothes and just really the essentials. And we weren't allowed to bring any of our toys at all, of course. And the only thing that I remember that we did bring was a deck of cards. And oh, did I learn how to play a lot of card games while I was in camp. So the other thing was that during that time that we were in the camps, you know, here's my brother Tom, another story about him. He was supposed to be in 10th grade, so he would have been 10th, 11th, 12th grade in camp. And my parents thought he was going to school, but every morning he would go off to another block and sit around with the other delinquents and play cards all day. And then he would come home, you know, as if he'd spent the day in school. And it wasn't until quite late on that finally one of the teachers came to my parents and they said, why isn't Tom in school? And that was the first that they heard, that he hadn't been going to school. And of course they were very upset because for the Japanese, you know, education is very important. And my brother's attitude was, look, I studied the Constitution in my civil rights classes back in Seattle, and I know what they're doing to us is not right. And it was his small way of protesting. But my father said to him, well, you know, if you just want to grow up and work in a restaurant and be a cook all your life, maybe you don't have to go back to school. But that kind of put a bug in his ear that maybe he better get back to school. There was a story that when we first got to camp, a little boy was overheard asking his mom, how is Santa ever going to find us? And that story got picked up in the newspapers, and so they say that thousands of presents got sent into the camps from various church groups, you know, from the Midwest and from out east, and that these presents then were distributed to the children in the camps. Well, I was in camp from age 6 till almost 10. I never got a present, neither did anybody else in my family. So I don't know where all these presents went, but they claim that there were 1,000 sent into the camps. The canal that was on the southern border of our camp was used as a swimming pond, and then if you had skates, you were allowed to skate on it in the winter. So the other ways that the people occupied themselves was through sports, as we were talking about earlier. So especially for the high school age kids, they formed all the sports teams, you know, for baseball, basketball, football. They petitioned the administration for the equipment and all. And the teams in our camp would play the teams from the surrounding little towns. And because those teams always had to come into our camp to play the game, we always had the home field advantage. And so we were always, you know, top of the league, winning all the games. And then, of course, there are a lot of social events. So I think really your experience in camp really depended on your age. For some of these people that were in their late teens, early 20s, it was a very social time for them, because you're thrown in all of a sudden with all these other people, you know, with your same kind of background, and you had these events like dances on the weekends, and parties to go to. So they did try to make, you know, life as normal as possible for us. The biggest job that my mother had to do was the laundry. Imagine doing laundry for a family of 12, all by hand. And other than that, you know, she didn't have to worry about any cooking. There was really very little housekeeping to do. So in a strange way, these years in camp for her was almost like a little mini vacation. And what they did was they organized different kinds of craft classes. And this is really what occupied her time, because she was not made to go out and work because she still had young children at home. But anybody who was an adult was put to work. And so I had 3 siblings that were out of high school. My oldest sister, Marion, actually worked as helping out at a preschool in the camp. And then she ended up getting married while she was in camp and had her first child in camp. And then next was my brother Fred, and they put him to work in the warehouse. And as soon as the military decided that they were going to start letting people of Japanese ancestry volunteer to serve in the military, this was in early 1943, my brother Fred left the camp to go to his physical in Salt Lake City. But he didn't pass his physical, so he was not able to join the military and volunteer like he wanted to. But because Salt Lake City was outside of the military zone, he decided, well, I'm out here, I'm just going to stay on. So he found himself a job at a hotel as a bellhop, and he stayed on out there then from 1943 on. He wasn't in the camp with the rest of us. This is the hospital clinic. Again, you know, no actual hospital building, but they did use one of the blocks for the hospital, and then had these hospital wards where my sister had her baby. Can you imagine being a young mother with a brand new baby and going back to a unit with no running water, and then having to walk like half a block to get water and things, and of course no refrigeration for any kind of milk that you might want to keep. So then my brother Joe, who graduated from Hunt High School, that was the name of the high school in our camp, he graduated in June of 1943 at the age of 18. And the day after he graduated, he volunteered to serve in the military. And he was, because of his language ability, he was assigned to the Military Intelligence Service. And they had a language school here in Minnesota. First it started at Savage, they called it Camp Savage, and it used to be these Quonset huts for homeless men. But they cleared all that out, and that's where they started the school. And then when the school became too large to be housed there, they moved the school in 1944 to Fort Snelling, where it stayed until, I think, 1946. But there were about 6,000 Nisei men like him who went through this language school. And then they went on to serve in every major theater in the Pacific. and were assigned to every unit in the Army, as well as for the Allied forces, not only just the American military, but Allied forces as well. So then my brother, this is his graduation picture from his language school in Fort Snelling in 1944, and he goes on then to serve in the Philippines, and from there, as soon as the war was over, they were one of the first units then to be sent into occupied Japan. And as time went on, especially after the very last court case, which was the Mitsue Endo versus the United States of America, when she argued about habeas corpus, that a person has a right to face their accuser and have a trial. And then that court went to the Supreme Court, and that was when the Supreme Court finally agreed, yes, that's true, and therefore we knew that these camps then were going to start being, disassembled. And so from 1944 on, the numbers started dwindling in our camps. But because they wanted to figure out who could be trusted outside of the camps, anybody who was 17 years and older was subjected to what we called a loyalty test. Now the problem was they used the same test to see who could serve in the military, as well as just those who were asking for leave clearance, to leave the camps. And so two of the questions that were the most problematic were the question that asked, are you willing to serve in the United States military wherever you're ordered to go? I'm paraphrasing it, but something like that. And of course, people were wondering, well, if I answer yes to that question, does that mean that I'm automatically volunteering myself to serve in the military now? They were wondering what would happen. And of course, they even asked that to people like my father, who by then was like 63 years old. And my mother, even the women were asked this question. So, and then the other question that was problematic was the next one, which asked, will you swear allegiance to the United States of America and forswear any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? Well, the problem with that question is people of my generation felt absolutely no allegiance to the Emperor of Japan because we'd never been to Japan, and we felt very American. So it was in a way insulting for them to, assume that we had allegiance and therefore we have to forswear it. And so that was another problematic question. But based on those two questions, if you answered no to either one of those questions, or if you left them blank, you were considered disloyal. Or if you put a qualifying answer, yes, I will serve only if you let my family out of the camp, or something like that, you were considered disloyal. And then they started the segregation movement, where anybody who answered no to either one of those questions got moved out of the camp they were in and moved into Tule Lake in California. And then those in Tule Lake who were loyal had the option of moving out of Tule Lake into one of the other 9 camps. And so there was this shifting going on. And the thing is that I think they ended up with maybe about 18,000 people in Tule Lake. Anyway, they made it a much more secure camp where they had not just one ring of barbed wire, but double barbed wire, electrified barbed wire. And whereas our camps only had 6 or 8 of those turrets with the watchtowers, I think they had 26. And they even had built a stockade inside of Tule Lake for troublesome prisoners who were, so they were treated much more harshly. And even to this day, whenever we as Japanese Americans see each other and people my age, the first thing we ask each other is, "Oh, what camp were you in?" And we would tell each other where we were. But for some reason, those that were in Tule Lake, they don't want to say what camp they were in, because they really did become ostracized, not only from our own community, but of course, the community at large. They didn't take kindly to them that they were refusing to serve. So we end up in Minnesota really because of my brother, who was in, who had, gone through Fort Snelling. And when the war is over, we were in the camps until the bitter end. My father, didn't want to go back to Seattle. We had to decide, well, where are we going to move? And so it ended up that we came here to Minnesota because this is my infamous brother Tom here. He, when my brother Joe was here in Fort Snelling, or in Savage, the first thing he did was he sent for my brother Fred, who was wasting his time as a bellhop in Salt Lake City, and said to him, look, you're just wasting your time. That's a no-end job. Come out to Minnesota and I'll get you enrolled in Dunwoody Institute. And that's where he ended up going. And my brother then, one of the jobs that he worked was at a dry cleaner's downtown. And this dry cleaner was very good to him and actually loaned him the money to make a down payment on a house for us. And so in order to repay that loan, my brother ended up working 3 jobs as a 23-year-old. He worked a full-time day job, he worked a night job, he worked a weekend job. And then he learned the dry cleaning trade at Dunwoody Institute and ended up then as a small business owner and really became quite successful at it. And he had the Red Robin Cleaners in St. Paul in Highland Village, and they had a branch on Grand Avenue. I don't know if some of you St. Paulites might be familiar with that, but that was my brother's cleaner. So that's how he got to Minnesota. And then, so I'm talking in like 1944 now, he's here. My sister Amy in the middle, my brother Joe got her a job as doing secretarial work at Fort Snelling. So she got out of camp that way. And then they said, well, we better send for Tom because he hasn't been in school. And so they found a family for him that lived around Lake Calhoun that was willing to take him in sort of like a houseboy. And so he went there, and then he finished his high school education at West High School, which no longer exists, but it was, in that part of town. And I have to tell you, he did turn out all right, though, because then he went on to serve in the military, and he actually served during the Korean War. And then he went to college on the GI Bill, and he became a math teacher. So he ended up his career as a high school math teacher. And this is the telegram then that was sent to this man named James Heiner, who was the War Relocation Authority administrator here in the Twin Cities. So when we got released from the camps, it was almost like we were on parole. Okay, so they had to notify this James Heiner that this family of Japanese are coming to the Twin Cities. And it lists, all of us here. It doesn't say Sally because my real name is Shigeo. And, here we are, and here's where we're going to live, and so on. And we were told when we came to town, just don't congregate amongst a whole lot of other Japanese people, And the area that we lived in, we were the only Japanese family for blocks around. And so I was always the only person of Japanese ancestry in my class all the way from 4th grade when I started here through high school. And in that way, there was a certain kind of notoriety or popularity. So, you end up getting voted, class secretary and, representative on the council and all these kinds of things. And this is then the house that my brother was able to buy for us in South Minneapolis. Very large, as you can see, a Victorian-style house, 4 bedrooms, but only 1 bathroom. And then here you see when we first came to Minnesota. By then I was almost 10 years old. My brother Henry on the end here in this picture is going to start 2nd grade, so he must have been like about 7 or so. And my parents. Now, by the time we got out of the camp, my father then was already 64 years old. And my mother, of course, was 14 years younger, so she's 50. But can you imagine at that age having to start your life all over again? I would say that he suffered the most. He really went into a depression because it was hard for him to find a job. And the only job he ended up working in the restaurant of the Curtis Hotel, which used to be one of the big downtown hotels. But when we were living in Seattle, and of course when we were in the camps, he really didn't have to use English a lot. That's one of the advantages of being in a segregated neighborhood. But now you're like a fish out of water. You come here, you're the only Japanese family for miles around. All of a sudden you need that English. And working in that hotel, it was just too much for him to handle the English. And so then he spent the rest of his years that he worked working as a janitor for what was then St. Mary's Hospital on on Riverside Avenue. And that's all he spent. But really, he lived until he was 88. But I want to say that he just existed. He really was in this kind of state of depression. And of all the other siblings, the one that I think it had the most psychological effect on was my sister, who was 13 when she went into camp, and 16 then when we are leaving the camps. By 16, she had already graduated from high school because she had been skipped along, And of course, my parents couldn't afford to send any of their children on to college. All of my siblings did really well in school, and they all wanted to go on to college. But it wasn't until my sister, who's 2 years older than I am, and then myself and my youngest brother, we were the only three that were allowed to go on to college right out of high school. Because by then our family had kind of pulled themselves together enough to be able to do that. Otherwise, everybody else was expected to go to work and whatever money they earned, turn into the family pot so that we could support the family. And so my 13-year-old sister, who went into camp at that age and came out at 16, now she has to try to find a job at age 16. And nobody's wanting to hire her. She finally ends up working for what was then Donaldson Department Store as in the alterations department. And but within 4 or 5 years, she started having a nervous breakdown. And so she spent really most of her adult life under psychiatric treatment. And the psychiatrist said that he thought the precipitating incident was her life in camp. And the fact that she was actually the oldest child left there when it came time for us to move, because these others had gone on ahead. And so at age 16, she is in charge of my parents and then the 4 younger siblings of getting us from Minidoka, Idaho to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And she was just a nervous wreck about this because we had to transfer trains in Omaha, and making sure we're on the right track and all that. And so it definitely, I think, had a psychological effect on her. And so, as I said, I think really the experience you have in camp really depended on your age. And I think I was fortunate in that I was young enough that by the time, I got here, I could recover. The main effect it had on me was that I would say for a good part of my school life, I always felt like the odd one. I was very self-conscious about being Japanese, and I wished I wasn't Japanese. I tried to be as American as possible. That's why Shigeo turned into Sally. And a lot of, Niseis did that. They changed their names to English names. And I really felt that I grew up being ashamed of my Japanese culture, that there was something wrong with being Japanese. And David Mura says in his book, Turning Japanese, that if you are arrested for shoplifting, Well, when you get out of jail, you just stop shoplifting. But what if you get put in prison because you're Japanese? What do you do when you get out? You know, you're still Japanese. And I think that's why it had that kind of effect. You know, so you'll find that many of my generation refused to learn the Japanese language. You know, they didn't want to follow the Japanese traditions. They wanted to make their life as American as possible. So, I do have a short 10-minute film. Do we have time for it? Of a pilgrimage to Minidoka. If not, we can
Maybe
skip
we
it.
can watch it next week,
Okay.
or I can circulate it too.
Shall we save time for questions?
Yeah, let's do the question. So
Okay.
another, let's say 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll end this public portion of our class. But let's open up for discussion,
Okay.
questions from the floor.
So, any questions from the group? And please speak loudly so I can hear. Oh, I must have covered everything. No, really? No questions?
They will come.
Do you feel like as you got older and when you were out of camp, you wanted to learn about your Japanese ancestry and your traditions yet, or were you still
Okay. She's asking, when I got older, did I want to learn about my Japanese ancestry and tradition? Well, yes, as luck would have it, when I was here at the University of Minnesota, that's where I met the man that would be my husband, and he was an exchange student from Japan. And so then after we got married, the company that he went to work for, which is Carlson Companies, sent him to open the branch in Japan. So we lived in Japan for 17 years.
Where?
One year in Tokyo, but 1 year in Yokohama, but the rest in Tokyo. In Harajuku.
Oh my goodness, jeez.
Right on Omotesando and Meiji-dori intersection. You know which, right?
Little Beverly Hills.
High fashion. It's like Rodeo Drive of Tokyo. They used to call it the Champs-Elysees. Anyway, so it really wasn't until then when we went to Japan that I really started to learn to appreciate my Japanese culture. So I started taking Japanese lessons through a tutor, and I got to the 3rd grade level. And I took some of those arts and crafts kinds of classes and learned how to cook some Japanese dishes. And then I really learned to appreciate what a beautiful culture they really have. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
When you were living when your family was in Seattle, did any of your siblings or parents go back to Japan to visit?
Did any of my siblings go back to Japan while we were, you mean after the war?
No, before the war.
Before, no, none of us had ever traveled to Japan. Right. And so we knew absolutely nothing about Japan. Just, what our parents told us, but which wasn't a lot. Yeah. Yes?
What happened to your family's property in the restaurant and
Well,
those things?
we lost it all. For one thing, while you were in the camps, there was no way for you to pay your property taxes, let alone the mortgage. At $16 a month, that doesn't go very far. And the bank accounts were frozen. But my parents hadn't built up a big account anyway, because raising that many kids, they were always kind of living week to week. But they lost everything. The few things we wanted to save, we stored in the gymnasium of the Seattle Baptist Church. But as was typical of many of the other places where people stored things, it was broken into and vandalized, and so we had nothing left to go back to. Mm-hmm. Yes.
After you resettled to Minnesota, what role did your family have in the redress movement? Or did it
What role did we have in the redress movement? Well, all those years that the redress movement was going on, I was living in Tokyo. So I knew very little about it, because I moved to Tokyo in 1967, and stayed there until 1984. And so I knew very little about the redress movement. And it wasn't until I came back to the States in 1985 that I heard about it. And then, of course, when it came time to apply, put in my applications. But I don't think my siblings were that involved in the redress movement, although my oldest brother Fred and my brother Tom were both very active in the JCL. I mean, I know they both served as president of the organization at one time or another, but I think they were just so busy, just, you know, trying to make a life.
I was struck by the picture of the military police as you were brought into the camps, but do you have any other memories in the camp as a kid of like interaction with security and policing around the camp?
Well,
Was that very visible or not very visible?
Well, we always knew they were there, you know, because they always had their guns pointed at us. But there wasn't that kind of interaction and camaraderie. They pretty much stayed to themselves. I mean, they didn't enter in any of the activities or anything like that. I just remember when we had to get on the trains from our time in Puyallup going to Minidoka, and just walking through the gauntlet of soldiers, you know, with their rifles and their bayonets, and kind of walking through that, and being, you know, scared about that. And then I do remember the armed guards on the train.
And then what about, like, you mentioned when a family came to visit or something? Was there like is there search procedures, or how hard was it to go in and out for those who had?
The person that came to visit was actually not in our family, but a friend of mine. But I know that when you first approached Minidoka, there was this sentry gate and kind of a building. That's the only structure that's left there now, and or it's partially left there. And probably you had to go through the, you know, normal search and procedures and things, and documentation, and why are you here, kind of thing. So I don't know how difficult it would be for people to. I don't think it was that difficult for people to visit, because one of the things was that the pastor of that Japanese Baptist church, because we were only allowed to bring what we could carry, he then used his church bus to go back and forth between Seattle and Minidoka, and because people would ask them, oh, you know, I left such and such behind in the gymnasium of your church, can you bring it for me? And he would fill up his bus and drive it back to Minidoka with things that people asked for. And eventually, he and his family moved to Twin Falls, Idaho for the duration of the war. Now, this is a Caucasian pastor I'm talking about, with his family, because he had lost his whole congregation, basically, and he wanted to be near his people. And so he moved there, but his wife was very unhappy, and they ended up getting divorced.
Sally, one of the things that I've noticed in Karen's family was a lack of resentment.
A lack of what?
Resentment.
Oh, lack of resentment.
And I've always respected them for that.
Right.
And wonder, how was it that you could take this injustice and take this humiliation and somehow recover from that and develop into productive, normal, healthy human beings?
Well, I think a lot of that is part of the Japanese culture, you know, because we have this saying, shikatagarai, you know, it's no use, there's nothing you can do about it, just, you know, accept it and go on with it. And that was kind of the attitude, you know, of my parents. I think as far as resentment, I think my oldest siblings were resentful. And they don't like to talk about their experience in camp at all. I always try to get more information out from them, you know, and their excuse to me is, oh, I don't remember. They don't want to talk about it. But I was really too young to even realize the enormity of what was happening to us. I just felt safe that I was with, my family. We weren't separated at all, which some families were, especially if the father was taken away by the FBI and then he put in an internment camp somewhere in Missoula, Montana, or Bismarck, North Dakota, or somewhere, and the rest of the family was sent to camp. So I think it has to do a lot with, maybe it's more Buddhist than anything, kind of that acceptance of your situation. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So your family was Baptist, and obviously there were a lot of Baptist people like in the camp too. So how did religious facilities work on the camp? Did you have them? Did you have to do it yourself?
Well, they did allow Buddhism to continue being practiced, and of course any Christian religion. The only religion they did not allow was Shintoism, which is worship of the emperor, right? But in the beginning, when the FBI rounded up these close to 2,000 people within 48 hours, a lot of them were Buddhist priests. Buddhist priests and teachers in the Japanese language schools, if you were an editor of Japanese language newspaper, if you were an instructor in a martial arts school, these people were rounded up and sent off to these Department of Justice camps. And my father's cousin was one of them because he was a strawberry farmer, but he had dynamite on his property, and they thought that was suspicious. Well, of course, he only used it to clear the tree stumps, but this thing about dynamite was a big thing, I guess, back in those days, because I think in one of the articles, was it that Lieutenant General DeWitt wrote, said, well, there are some Japanese who are willing to strap dynamite on their bodies and blow themselves up. We do have radicals like that, so maybe they were suspicious of anybody with dynamite.
What craft skills did your mother learn particularly?
What did my mother learn? Well, she learned Oshuji, which is calligraphy, because both my mother and father had just what the compulsory education, which would be about the equivalent of 8th grade here in the States. And so then in camp, she was able then to study this very lyrical way of writing Japanese, very beautiful, and she really got very good at it. Besides that, she took pattern making and dressmaking, especially so she could, sew clothes for us. And there was 3 things that she took. I think the other one was flower making. They made crepe paper flowers, and they used them, especially like if there was a funeral, that all the ladies would band together and make these flowers and make these wreaths and things of artificial flowers to use at a funeral. So.
How would she use it after camp? How did she use her skills that she learned in camp?
Well, and then after we got to Minnesota, she was very much a stay-at-home mom, and it was very difficult for her to, exist in this kind of environment of Minnesota. And so she always used one of us kids as her interpreter, whenever she had to go to the doctor, one of us would go with her. When she went grocery shopping, so often we would go with her. But I remember funny things like, she wanted to buy vegetable soup at the store. So we would show her on a piece of paper, okay, it starts with this letter, and she'd get the paper turned upside down, she'd come home with asparagus soup, so just things like that she had a hard time adjusting, And it wasn't until she found a local Japanese language church group here in the Twin Cities that she finally had some kind of social life. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Given your experiences in the schools in the camp, what inspired you to become a teacher?
Well, what inspired me to be a teacher? Actually, it was my 6th grade teacher here in Minneapolis. I think the thing was that, for some reason, every day, she sent me and my best friend down to the kindergarten classroom to read stories to the kids while the teacher left the room. And now I know it must have been a coffee break, you know, but anyway, so we did that, and I just remember and enjoying it so much, you know, having the kids gather around and so on, that I thought to myself, oh, maybe this is something I'd like to do. So I did end up teaching elementary school, you know.
So let's end our portion here then. Let's
Okay.
thank Sally.
Oh,